Coming up on today's video, there are major schedule changes to WWE's pay-per-view calendar. Rob Van Dam has shot on CM Punk. Chris Jericho has his take on Bray Wyatt's WWE return, and a fascinating name was spotted backstage at a recent NXT taping. I'm Michael Sidgwick from WhatCulture.
I'm Michael Hamflett from WhatCulture.
And this is the news. But firstly, day one has been cancelled, according to the very reputable Brandon Thurston of WrestleNomics, in a report corroborated by Brian Alvarez of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, who also came through with additional details about what the general vague complexion of the schedule is going to look like without any actual confirmations of scrapped or indeed returning pay-per-views. But the general picture, and then this is per Brian Alvarez of the Wrestling Observer, is that there is going to be a more broad focus on international pay-per-views with less gimmick pay-per-views. And before I go to my esteemed colleague for colour commentary on that, I just want to say I welcome that absolutely massively. We both attended Clash at the Castle in person. It was an absolutely phenomenal show that was basically one kind of happy ending away from being outright perfect, in my opinion. I'm generally quite a cynical WWE fan. I had a magic time. It was great. The match quality was great. Unlike other WWE UK pay-per-views, it was momentous. It was canon. The atmosphere was to die for. It looked absolutely spectacular and massive. Going around Cardiff during the day was great. We've just watched AEW Rampage in Toronto be white hot, and we know what's kind of happened to that show of late as well. And I think every somewhat cynical WWE fan has had pretty dim views of gimmick pay-per-views and the fact that they are backwards in terms of storytelling. So this is yet more great news from the Papa H era of WWE, is it not?
It is. It does. I think you're right to apply a little bit of that Papa H cynicism, because again, it feels like almost audacious and obvious fan service. For years, people have clamoured for an event like Clash at the Castle. 30 years was too long between SummerSlam and Clash at the Castle. But not just we're speaking from the UK, but I'm sure there will be fans all over the world that feel the same about their nations getting international shows. There is loads and loads of supporting evidence from even something like a Super Showdown in Australia a few years ago. They can fill stadiums with once-a-year events. There is evidence of that. The aesthetic is incredible. It makes WWE look like as they would always say, the recognised leader of sports entertainment all over the world. They love all that kind of stuff. And that in line with the removal of gimmick pay-per-views, or at least the shifting of it a little bit. I mean, it's interesting that he might potentially, for example, want to take away something like Hell in a Cell, while arbitrarily inserting War Games into Survivor Series. So it's still very much I'll take that away, but I'll give you what you want because you like it.
Yeah.
So there's these WWE pay-per-view calendars are always up for changing. They're always up for reshuffling, and we should note as well that this is all, bizarrely, all of it is still rumour. WWE are the last ones to confirm this day one cancellation, even though we feel relatively confident because of the sources we're reporting from. I typically welcome, with the exception of the big four, which does feel something that we should cling to as WWE's pillars, I welcome these changes anyway. I think it's quite nice when that calendar gets a freshen up, because you can only do so many years of the routine Hell in a Cell events, the TLC at Christmas and all that, before you desperately need it. I think it helps the weekly TV shows to give those a bit of a rejig as well.
Yes, absolutely. Let us know in the comments below if you would like to see a returning pay-per-view. I suspect you're going to do that anyway. Hamflett, if you could pick one old pay-per-view to return, which one would you pick?
Nobody buys it. King of the Ring. All day
no
long.
one buys it, though.
The one-night tournament. Nobody ever pays for it. Loads of evidence. But the good ones are great and still stand up to this day. Well booked, and Triple H, we're led to believe he might be able to do it. Well booked, they're just such fun events. They feel different, and the stakes, and wrestlers are knackered and sell injuries wrestling 3 times in a night. It's something that WWE, even when they're doing it on TV, Raws are better for one-night tournaments. So I would like that. I think the elevated prestige would be nice.
If I'm going to be cynical, and I am, ultimately something like a No Mercy or an Armageddon, it's a set. It's a set and not an actual themed event that is going to necessarily be a great indicator of quality or a guarantee if it does return under those names. But King of the Ring's different, and I think we've learned from Bray Wyatt's return, which we're going to talk about imminently on this video, of course, is that there's a definite amount of trust placed in Triple H. And obviously pay-per-view buy rates, it was never the most successful of the big 5 pay-per-views, but it's a different world now. Dominated revenue stream wise by them TV rights fee money, so why the hell not? I think a lot of trust has been placed in Triple H, and he might be able to get it right. Absolutely. Forgive me for checking my wrist for notes. If The Rock can do it, so can I. Yes, Rob Van Dam, a shot on CM Punk in a story that scans as shocking until you kind of remember who CM Punk is. And this is not a burial, and Rob Van Dam, who spoke to Inside the Ropes, also says this wasn't a burial, just a fact of life, to quote the returning LA Knight. He was speaking to Inside the Ropes and told again the story that's a bit shocking but not really, that when he returned to WWE following his sort of fateful 2006 suspension, that he was very stunned to learn that once CM Punk had told him, look, there's a thief in the locker room, we're trying to snuff out the thief, so I'm going to be holding a team meeting to determine that. Now, we've heard the stories before of CM Punk, self-anointed locker room leader, much to the wry amusement of Booker T, Cody Rhodes, and Kevin Owens across different promotions. So it's not a surprise. But if you look at the timeline, CM Punk had debuted that very year.
Yeah.
Like that very year. Look, I think it's great. Ultimately, you know, people have their opinions on CM Punk. I have several different ones all at the same time because that is the man he is. But ultimately, if he didn't have this unshakable belief and, quite frankly, entitlement within himself, he simply would not be the performer that he is today. What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, Van Damme kind of echoes that, doesn't he? He talks about how big CM Punk's ego is, but then qualifies that by saying he understands why wrestlers would have to have big egos, especially within that version of WWE.
And Van Damme does.
And Van Damme himself
Yes.
does, like the guy that, you know, made all that money pointing at his head repeatedly, saying his own name over and over again while talking his own work up. So I think he understood that. I like this version of CM Punk, locker room leader, I think more than I like the other versions of it. We were kind of talking in the office before we came in to record. If you take a snapshot of that ECW, it's got your Bob Hollies, it's got Big Show wearing the belt like a wristwatch because Vince McMahon didn't trust anybody else with it anymore. That brand is already falling apart at the seams, but I guess imbued with a little bit of confidence from Paul Heyman at the time. Punk thinking, well, I'm here now, time to step up. It remains weird that Vince McMahon himself didn't gravitate towards Punk, or certainly didn't for as long as it took him to gravitate towards him, because all the stories that always creep out speak to a guy that kind of fit in that environment. I know The Undertaker didn't like him not wearing a suit, but all of this kind of thing must have been right up his street, mustn't it?
Absolutely. We did promise more Bray Wyatt news. You are absolutely starving for Bray Wyatt news. And so you're probably aware at this point that he's made his first promo return on SmackDown following his return at Extreme Rules. We are going to go more in depth on our thoughts on that on the SmackDown Review podcast, which you can listen to, of course, on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And we also record, easy for me to say, daily wrestling podcasts. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically the gist is Bray Wyatt with a sort of kind of triumphant or positive sounding theme, at least in relation to his sort of swampy, discordant numbers with which he was previously associated. Went to the ring, cut this really heartfelt, sort of out of character, fourth wall breaking promo, however you want to frame it, in which he seemed to very earnestly thank fans for staying with him and making him feel worthwhile, because there was a time subsequent to his WWE release that he really didn't feel like he'd contributed anything and that everything he did was kind of meaningless and all the rest of it. And then he was interrupted on the Tron by sort of a digital version of the masked character he appeared to debut under at Extreme Rules. Now, we don't know whether it's a big sort of 4D chess heel ploy or whether he's going to be sort of feuding with himself or what, but Chris Jericho has said on Twitter when asked that he doesn't believe a word of it, but he loves it. So he seems to be under the idea that Bray Wyatt is masquerading as a babyface. But again, we've got a podcast to plug, so don't blow your beans. But what briefly do you think about this?
I think Chris Jericho's gonna Chris Jericho. He's
a big supporter of Wyatt in the old locker room, we should add.
I think there is some earnest praise being dished out to Bray Wyatt's performance and indeed the story in general. And I think Chris Jericho's he knows his place in the wrestling world at the moment, and he knows that everybody is speaking about Bray Wyatt.
Yeah.
And he's never been one to avoid just getting in on talking points, even if it crosses company divides between AEW. Obviously, he's carrying the Ring of Honor belt at the moment, so he probably quite likes being almost like an in-ring gatekeeper of all of wrestling. I will comment on everything no matter where I work. So I think this is just a little bit of gamesmanship from Chris Jericho, and maybe a bit of an attaboy to Bray Wyatt, and he's getting plenty of those at the moment, but not just from audiences, not just from Fiend fans. Bray Wyatt being, there's a lot of talk in wrestling promos now of looking in the mirror and knowing who you are. I'm trying to look in the mirror and be the Fiend, and I am the Fiend. This can be his version of that. And I suppose it doesn't hurt Chris Jericho to be getting in on the conversation. Eva Marie, of all people, did it on Friday.
Yeah.
This, regardless of where you're
Wyatt's
at,
numbers out the ass.
Yeah, it's regardless of where you're at with Bray Wyatt in terms of what you liked about him before, what you like about him now. if you're near him in the conversational sphere, and wrestlers always want to stay right on that bubble, you know, you're getting numbers, you're getting conversation yourself. Jericho, ever the worker, as of this morning, as of this conversation, has pulled some Bray Wyatt discourse back to himself. It was only, I don't think the two things are related, but it was only a few weeks ago where the Wrestling Observer got a story that Chris Jericho will be in high demand when contract season next comes up. You know, work is going to work.
It's going to work, but ultimately Chris Jericho was in that locker room in the mid 2010s when it was kind of all going awry, and there was just week after week of a push getting failed or a performer's like run getting scaled back or what have you. And he was always very, very supportive of Seth Rollins, Kevin Owens, and the Bray Wyatts and the Luke Harpers. So, you know,
lovely picture of them all in the Luke Harper shirt, isn't it, from that
absolutely.
era?
So I do think there's a little bit of him just saying like, good on him. Like it's about time that he had some decent creative. One would hope anyway behind him. And finally, finally, because we're not technologically gifted or anything like that, this is the final news story of the video basically. But two very interesting names were spotted backstage at NXT TV last week, one of which was he's got a lot of heat on him. And, you know, where's the line? Bobby Fish was backstage at NXT alongside Anthony Green, who also worked previously in WWE under the name
August Gray.
August Gray. You know who he reminds me of?
Who's that, Sidge?
He kind of reminds me of like Simon Pegg, but a bit jacked.
I think that's a fantastic take. I think that's a really, really...
That's the first time you've heard that?
I've never heard that one before. That's a spot on take.
Well, that's who he reminded me of.
Should mention that on the podcast sometime.
Indeed. What's interesting as well is that if you want to add a line between the dots and connect those two things, is that they both have direct and indirect Diamond Mine affiliations, in that August Gray was actually involved in Diamond Mine in the original iteration of that stable, which has basically seen more changes in the New World Order at this point. And Bobby Fish, of course, was in the Undisputed Era alongside Diamond Mine mainstay Roderick Strong. So if we can recklessly speculate on the next creative for all of these performers, we can. There's potential to do some kind of split faction, double dojo, Cobra Kai-esque warfare there. Or, basically, they could have just been seeing friends backstage. Or seeing friends backstage and enjoying the fact that we are basically doing this video.
I think that's it. Again, there's a little bit of work is going to work there. Wrestlers attending shows is nothing new. It being reported on that wrestlers are attending shows to generate a bit of speculation is also nothing new. Bobby Fish, of course, is the most interesting element of this, with no disrespect intended to Anthony Green, because everything we've heard from him or from his camp, or
he wanted this,
is that he would like to go back to WWE, or he was full of praise for his time working for Triple H.
That is the thing it's easy to infer this, basically, just to cover our backs.
It's he's been appearing for Impact, and you know there is nothing to say that he's not deliriously happy working for Impact Wrestling and getting to be the almost like a straight-edged superstar in his own right, getting to cut these promos that are like a little bit insider leaning, if you know what to listen for, and you can certainly hear them. It's like just a time for Bobby Fish to be at NXT. It's quite nice for the trajectory that he's trying to, like the course he's trying to plot for himself currently. It fits where you would imagine he would want us to be having these conversations, certainly. But it could be nothing, but it could be something. Triple H has, already obviously developed a reputation for bringing back people that he feels maybe shouldn't have been fired from WWE in the first place. We don't need to list off the list of returnees again, but such a spate in the last few months, it is within reason to think that two ex-NXTers, if they were well liked, could be, the door could be open, I guess. So it doesn't hurt for this kind of story to be out there.
Look, I know I've had a little bit of smug, snarky fun at the expense of Bobby Fish there, but I'll say one thing. Considering the way he was wrestling towards the end of his NXT run and how he looked physically in AEW towards the end, they'll be getting an absolutely fantastic worker given his age. And provided he's in the correct role and he's not coming back as like voice of the voiceless or whatever, persona non grata, if it's just Bobby Fish wrestling like Bobby Fish, I thought everything in the ring went tremendously well in AEW. So you might be getting a really great, in fact, solid hand on the cards if in fact he does return. That's it for today's news video. We'll be pumping out more lists, one expects, later on today. We've got Podcast City out the ass later on. We've got the Rampage review, the SmackDown review, the WWE Raw preview, so subscribe to Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from for that. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel here. And until then, thank you very much for spending your morning with us, or afternoon, wherever you are, and we'll see you soon.